Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Christiane Hoffman. I'm the director of America House. I'm very pleased that you've joined us today for this important discussion on propaganda and the challenges facing journalists in the current information war. We have a great panel today. Katya Gorczynska is the managing editor for investigative programming at Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Tatiana Matichak is the co-founder of the website Stop Fake. And also we have Anne Applebaum today, one of the most renowned experts on propaganda, communism, and civil society development in Central and Eastern Europe. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and historian, and a columnist for Washington Post. So joining us also today is our ambassador, Ambassador Pyatt. Thank you so much for being here. And I thought before we started, maybe you'd like to say a few words.
Thanks, Christiane. Always a pleasure to be at America House. Thanks especially, Anne, for coming here to do this program. Just a few thoughts from me. I mean, when I look back on this 2-year period of transformation that Ukraine has lived through, I think one of the more important and unanticipated aspects of it is the information warfare. The way in which the Kremlin has chosen to weaponize information as part of its strategy to deny Ukraine and the Ukrainian people their sovereign choice about their future, but also to wage war. And this is something which has implications for how all of us in the Euro-Atlantic community think about the future of our relationships and our relationship with Russia. It's also very important in terms of thinking about how to make Ukraine successful. That is to say, the modern European democratic Ukraine that the Ukrainian people have chosen and have demanded, it's not going to be, Ukraine will not arrive at that destination unless the government can be effective in getting its story out, unless the government is attentive to the narratives that the Kremlin has used as part of this campaign, which you have seen in Washington, all across Europe, aimed at dividing us, sowing disunity on the question of sanctions, but also questioning the degree to which the Ukrainian people themselves believe in the transformation that this country has gone through. So, as Christiane said, terrific panel today with a lot of people who have put quite a bit of thought into these questions. And I think especially appreciate the fact that we've got Anne here. And I say that as somebody who has sort of lived through this dramatic period of transformation that Ukraine has undergone and has suffered from the inability to think strategically about some of what's developed. And Anne has done a lot of work trying to understand this new model of weaponized information and what it portends for the future of Europe, the future of U.S. engagement with this part of the world, and indeed the future of Ukraine. So thanks for being with us, all of you, and thanks, Christiane, for having me here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador.
Mute your microphones, please.
Are we on?
Okay, so I would like to now introduce the facilitator for today's discussion. We're pleased to welcome Irina Halupa. She is an independent journalist and a fellow at the Atlantic Council. She has had a long, successful career with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and she is currently in Kyiv as a Fulbright scholar, where she's conducting research on Ukrainian political prisoners and documenting their stories. So please join me in welcoming Irina Halupa. And Irina, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Welcome to everybody, and I'm very happy to be in the company of 3 such powerful and exciting women, and I kind of think that this discussion is going to be a very good one. So just a few words about how we're going to do this. I will make a brief introduction, then each one of our panelists will speak from anywhere from 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll start a discussion, and we're eager to have you ask as many questions as possible, and we want this to be a conversation and not a lecture. So there's a famous quote that goes like this: "In war, truth is the first casualty." This quote is attributed to a Greek tragedian, Aeschylus, and it's a quote that keeps coming back every time a war erupts somewhere on our planet. Today, Ukraine is involved in a double war, a real war with bullets and blood and death, and an information war. In the real war, things are clear. There are bad guys and there are good guys. There are killers and those being killed. But the information war is a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced. It's very sophisticated, it's very slick, and it is extremely, extremely well produced. Some have described this process, this information war that Russia is waging, as the weaponization of words. Words become weapons. They are the book missiles that kill. In a conference that Anne organized in London last year, an overall title for this information war was The Menace of Unreality. An alternate narrative is created, a very dangerous alternate narrative that is not illusory in the sense that a film is, but it's a menacing reality that drags all of us in and undermines not only journalistic standards as such, but democratic principles that the Western world is based on. The Russian narrative is not only about selling falsehoods and illusion, it's about creating a parallel reality. It's a brazen attempt to create alternate truths. We're in a position now where people have serious discussions about what truth is. I was brought up and educated to believe that there was one truth. It turns out that according to the Russian recipe, there are multiple truths, and all of them have equal measure, equal weight in the Russian narrative. At a time of relentless ratings chasing and the ultimate marketization of information, assisted by an ever more supportive technology that increasingly creates passive media and information consumers, the Russian message, in all of its all-encompassing, sophisticated simplicity and slickness and neo-Soviet systematic approach, is tempting and very easy to consume. So what do we do as journalists? How do we peel away these layers of deceit and lies to find the truth? Do we serve truthful storytelling, or do we serve the cause? Ukraine's struggle to safeguard its sovereignty, independence, and narrative. That global challenge is what we're going to talk about with these three amazing women. So, as you all probably know, Anne's very, very impressive biography. I kind of want to be her when I grow up. Not only does she write books and wonderfully crafted opinion pieces, she even finds time to write a cookbook about great Polish cuisine and goes into forests and gathers mushrooms.
Not much.
Recently, the Legatum Institute that Anne is associated with launched a new initiative called Beyond Propaganda. This series is meant to help media experts and general public be better equipped against media manipulation across the world. And yesterday at the talk that you gave here on nationalism and why Ukraine needs nationalism, you said that the best tool against propaganda is knowledge, that we need a toolkit to learn to recognize what's true and what isn't. Using your Beyond Propaganda platform as a background, what tools do we need in this toolkit in Ukraine? And do Ukrainian journalists and regular citizens have those tools?
Right. Well, that's really the main question. But first of all, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, as I was happy to be here yesterday. And I am actually abashed to be on a panel with two people who probably know this subject much better than I do. I know it from a very different perspective. Just to explain what my project has been over the last year, me and a couple of colleagues have tried to understand what is the nature of sort of modern propaganda, and we don't even really like the word propaganda. We prefer disinformation, because a lot of what, and by the way, it's not unique to Russia, but a lot of what authoritarian regimes now do really doesn't resemble propaganda in the old-fashioned sort of Soviet sense of the word. Much of Russian disinformation has nothing to do with promoting Russia. It works differently in different places and in different countries, but some of it is simply about, as you just said, it has other goals. One of the goals is undermining people's faith in the media in general, so that when they watch television or when they read a newspaper, they don't believe anything. The most brilliant example of how this can work was following the crash of the Malaysian airliner last year, when the Russian response was not to say, we didn't do it. The response was to put out 15 different theories about how it was done. And ranging from plausible to implausible, a Ukrainian plane shot this plane out of the sky. It was a plot created by the Malaysian airline itself. There are all kinds of theories. And the point of this was to create a sense that this was a story with no explanation, and there never would be any answer. And somebody, I think from Radio for Europe, did an interview, in Moscow a few days later with people on the street and asked them, who shot down the plane? And most people said, I don't know and we'll never know. It will never be possible it's just going to be too hard to find out what happened. And that, of course, was the purpose of the propaganda, was to cover up even the idea that there could be a real explanation or people who were really responsible. Another goal is to create moral equivalences. So, and I've seen this done many times. So, okay, Putin, maybe he's corrupt, okay, but you're corrupt too, and you're corrupt in exactly the same way. And there's no difference between Russia and the West. It's all just propaganda, and it's an attempt to show that there are no differences between systems. Everything's all the same. It's a very, very cynical way of looking at the world. A third element, which existed in the past, but not in the extent that it does now, is this use of fake news, which you all know more about, obviously, than I do. But in the world of the internet and the advance of media technology means that it's now much easier to create fake photographs, fake news stories, fake experts, phony websites, fake think tanks, and false sources of information of all kinds, many of which are connected together in a way that looks like real information. So, for example, you can often trace links between. There'll be think tanks with names like the Center for Democracy and Development, and another one's called the Center for Institutional Change, and the other one's called Center for Global Politics or something, and they're all connected, and actually they're all Russian funded, and they all. They have very benign sounding names, but they do something else. And then there will be articles that are connected to them and attributed to them. So there's a whole world of sort of phony news which has phony sources. And these are layers of complication that we've never had before. So as I said, part of what we've tried to do is figure out, what it is, what are these phenomena, and try to describe them. In a way that that makes sense both to people here and particularly to people in Western Europe who find some of this almost incredible and don't necessarily believe it until you show it to them on paper that this is how it works. The second thing we've tried to think about is what institutions should fight it. So what are the correct responses? Because obviously, if you have in the Soviet-style era of propaganda, you could come back with counter-propaganda and, an alternate narrative that was more attractive. More or less, we have democracy, we have, McDonald's, we have, big cars, and we have Jackson Pollock and modern art, and, that was opposed to what you have, and that was a sort of contest that you could have in the 60s and 70s. That doesn't work anymore either. There's plenty of modern art in Moscow, among other things. In fact, I think the Russian oligarchs now control the modern art market. Somebody was telling me, at least in London, the Russian money is so important in contemporary art market. So the question is, how do you fight it, and which institutions should do it, and is the right response from governments? So obviously the Russian, the Russia, and by the way, I'll speak today mostly about Russia, even though our project actually we've looked at China, we've looked at Venezuela. And we've looked at Iran, and we've looked at ISIS as well, to look at how they also, because many of these organizations use the same techniques. But which organization should fight it? And the right answer isn't always the state. It's whereas in the olden days you founded Radio for Europe and Radio Svoboda, and you would that would, that was the thing that would do counter propaganda. That seems to now insufficient and maybe also ineffective in a way that it wasn't before. In a way, what you need is a kind of multiple solutions, and you need some solutions that come from civil society and some that come from television producers, and maybe the right way to respond is through the creation of and the sponsoring of things like Stop Fake, which I hope you'll talk about in a minute. And when I refer to a toolkit, we're thinking that we originally had this idea that there ought to be a kind of handbook, a sort of guide to disinformation. But now more and more, I think that there ought to be reliable websites where you can go to check. You see a story that looks fishy, you should have some source who could check it. I mean, there's a little bit of that exists now in organizations like Stop Fake and Bellingcat and others who do checking of stories online. But building up that into a proper institution, giving people working in multiple languages and giving people ways to check stories and ways to find out where photographs are coming from and so on would be one important tool. I mean, there may also have to be it may need to be part of civic education, learn to understand. I now say this to my children, and this applies, by the way, not only to politics, but to all kinds of other things. The internet is a huge arena for fakes and disinformation of all kinds, commercial disinformation as well as political disinformation. And teaching your children how to wade themselves through it and understand that not everything they read is true is very important. I mean, in the olden days, you could hand someone the New York Times, and okay, it wasn't always exactly right, but there was some procedure where people had done fact checking, and now they read Reddit, and that's information comes from all over the place and may not be true at all. So there needs to be a kind of civic component as well as a civil society component. I mean, some of the organizations that do that produce some of the most important internet Google and Facebook and so on, I know are also becoming interested belatedly in some of these issues and are looking themselves at tools that they could provide. And it may be that in the future the internet itself comes up with counter tools and so on. So anyway, our project has been to go through, and we're still doing it. I mean, and actually we're shifting this year to look at media literacy and to look at what which kinds of efforts work, which kinds of tools are most effective, and so on. So
Would you mind explaining media literacy? I mean it's a term that we're very comfortable with in the English-speaking world, but it may not necessarily be something that people here are completely familiar with. And,
media literacy is, well, I know that IREX, which is one of the organizers of this event, is very interested in this as well now. Media literacy is a way of teaching people how to read the media. I mean, as I explain to my children, you can teach it in schools, you can teach it through, through universities, you can teach it through, trade unions, you can teach it through all kinds of organizations, institutions. You can help people become literate and better at reading the newspaper or at watching television, so that you help them distinguish between different kinds of stories. And help them at least learn to compare this version of the news versus that version of the news and try and understand where it's coming from. And as I said, I think it's going to have to be, in the future, an important part of children's education. I mean, if you want people to, it's a little bit like teaching people how to use a bank or what is the stock market. You may have to teach them, how do you have a pension plan? How do you, how to plan, how to get through modern life financially. You may also have to teach them how to do it in terms of information, because the multiplicity of information and the growth and quantity of it is something that is really now on an absolutely new scale. It's one of these things where when I look back on the 20th century, there's a moment in the 1920s and 30s when there is also was an explosion of what was then new media. It was radio. It was mass production of newspapers on a new scale. And one of the side effects of this new form of media was it was immediately captured and immediately exploited by new kinds of propagandists. I mean, Hitler and Stalin were fantastically interested in the radio. Stalin in particular cared a lot about radio and how it could be manipulated and used. And, you know, it took, I don't know, a couple of decades for, you know, for there to be a response and for people to become more wary of manipulation and so on. You know, maybe that's gonna happen now. I mean, we may be at another stage when the explosion of media has led to an explosion of, growth in people who want to manipulate it, and maybe, you know, we're gonna need some time to come up with the antibodies or the forms of resistance to it. Anyway, that's an outline, little sketch of the project. It's not finished yet, but, you know, I'm happy to talk more specifically about what we're looking at and what we've examined, and, you know, also, obviously, I should finish by saying, this funny thing to say in an audience of Ukrainians. I mean, at some level, I also live in the middle of the information war. I am married to a Polish politician. I have, Russian trolls who are personally interested in me and have, there are stories about me I can find on the internet, and I can trace how they come from a source in Russia, and then I can watch them, appear on various different websites, and then I can see them in the Polish press, and I can see people quoting them. So I do know, I'm very experienced in how it works because I live in it. So, and I think almost anybody who does, who works in this part of the world in any kind of public position knows, exactly what that's like. And, coming to understand it and how it works is really the first stage of learning how to fight against it.
Thank you. Perhaps people who live in post-Soviet societies have an almost instinctive understanding of propaganda, in the sense that when the Soviet Union existed, everybody read between the lines, and if you read Pravda or any other official things, you kind of immediately knew that the opposite was true.
Yeah, but that's not true anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not true anymore.
No, but what I'm saying is that maybe people on some level in Ukraine and other countries have a healthy skepticism already built into their sense of perception of media. I mean,
although healthy skepticism also shades, I'd love to hear what you all think about this, can shade very quickly into cynicism in which nobody believes anything.
Yes.
And that's in some ways, just as bad, because then you have no sources of true information, and then it's very hard to have a political conversation of any kind.
Exactly.
So that's what's dangerous about it.
I know Katya wants to continue along those veins. You all know Katya Kuczynskaya, who has been with the Kyiv Post probably since its inception, and in the last few months has taken on a new calling. She now works for Radio Liberty, editing and overseeing their anti-corruption and journalistic and investigatory efforts. Katya, how has the current situation impacted on your work, and how do you combat this kind of, this Soviet mantra that there is no truth?
Well, actually, I'm going to start elsewhere and then get back to your question. I'll pick up where Anne left with the trolls, because I think that trolls are an extremely underestimated part of the information wars, and they're causing a lot more damage and have a lot more effect on the information environment than actually people are willing to admit.
I agree.
I mean, one of the effects that I have observed massively is that basically the phenomenon is so widespread, even in the West now, that a lot of reporters are basically not taking some type of stories anymore. And the editors, can't even assign a story, because they know that they will end up receiving 10,000 emails in the next morning, and their families will be threatened, and they're worried about their kids, and they say, well, you know what, I'm not going to take this story, I'm not going to write that story. And that is very, very dangerous, because journalists are a key part of the effort to combat this propaganda, and that means that they're not doing their job anymore, and it's really, really dangerous, because in the realm of alternative environments, you don't get the story that is actually as close to the truth as it gets, the actual reported story. And that's one of the goals of the Russian propaganda, as you have mentioned and Anne has mentioned. And going back to the goals of specifically Russian propaganda, I like to go back to Russia Today's front page, which is quintessential for understanding how it works. And if you look at the Russia Today motto, the motto is "Question more." So yes, it's about creating an alternative reality, and I mean, they're not shy about it. And again, when they go into their mission in more detail, they say, we deliver stories often missed by the mainstream media to create news with an edge. They admit directly that they're not reporting the news, they are creating the news and creating alternative environments right there on their homepage. And this may be funny, but it's not just about Russia Today. It's basically the essence of the Russian propaganda as such. It's just so, Russia Today is a central element of it, as we all know. And we have observed, Anne has mentioned, that we observed the creation of these alternative stories, especially in the case of MH17, when they deflected our effort into finding the truth with 1,000 stories, including dead bodies flying in the MH17 from Holland to Malaysia and so on and so forth. But I think there's a lot has been said about this and about the alternative stories and the danger. But I think that one danger has become overlooked very, very seriously, because in this environment where nobody believes that there could be a single story about a single truth about anything, the actual truth becomes one of the stories. So the truth becomes a tool of propaganda. It's playing in under this umbrella of propaganda, which is very, very dangerous, because people and you have two basic side effects that I have observed in the audience. One is they turn into zombies who either repeat one of the stories, the alternative stories, or believe that no truth can be found and keep repeating that line. But also the other effect that I observed, especially in students when I was speaking at Albach European Forum this year, I got to talk to a whole lot of Russian students, and I was flabbergasted at how little information they had, how poorly informed they were. They had no idea about any details of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and they had no idea about what was going on, and they were extremely apathetic in finding the information. And then I started talking about it a little more, and I realized that actually that is another side effect of the propaganda. People give up. Basically, they're not interested. They live their own little lives. They go to their jobs, and they do their studies, but they don't seek information. They don't care about information. They close up, and they become asocial, and which means change is less likely with the new generation, because they don't believe in anything. They don't believe that there can be change. They don't believe there can be truth. They don't believe it can be found. So I think that this is a side effect that is also not talked about. One of the things that struck me in my work as a journalist since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war is that we all come from the Soviet legacy, where we should actually be immune to at least some of the propaganda efforts, but we're not at all. We are extremely vulnerable, and the most striking thing, perhaps for me, especially in my current job, is the fact that our governments are extremely, they react to propaganda efforts of the Russians, for example, in our case, with an extremely knee-jerk fashion. They start their own propaganda efforts, which I think is completely the wrong way of dealing with that. And I mean, of course, the greatest case in point is the Ukrainian information ministry, which nobody knows what they're doing. Nobody has had any help from them. The only thing that I've heard of them lately is complaints from Western donors and Western embassies that they come begging for money for equipment and basically existing, and the Western governments are saying, guys, we don't actually think you should even exist. And they just don't get it. And the latest big thing that they did is they developed this concept of information security for Ukraine. And then I'm not even going to go into criticizing it. I'm just going to read one quote from the OSCE report on that particular concept, which says, the content may lead to undue restrictions on freedom of speech and thought. Furthermore, the legal character of the concept and its relationship with the law is unclear, and so it goes. They completely trashed this concept, and this is the fruit of their labor of the last half a year, and now it's supposed to become law of some sort, and the legal character of this thing is unclear. And nevertheless, even the most senior officials in the government, they believe that the Ukrainian media also should be patriotic and should sort of play their line and play along. And we've had a striking example of that this week. We've had a longer story. We were investigating corruption in the Secret Service. Basically, we spent a month outside their offices looking at what kind of cars they arrived to work in and documenting it, and then trying to trace the cars and asking people, how can you afford this car if, the car costs 50, 70, $100,000 and you make 4,000 greens a month, so the story was released on Thursday, and then on Friday we caught the president in Odessa and had an opportunity to ask him a question about the SBU and for his reaction on the story. And basically the president said, that patriotic media should be aware of the special role the SBU plays, and that there are a lot of patriots in the SBU. So basically he gave two messages, that about patriotic media, so he believes there should be such a thing as patriotic media and they should behave in a particular way, which was a striking admission from the president. And the second part of it was that, that the SBU are patriots and they should be untouched. And, although undoubtedly I believe that there are plenty of patriots in the SBU who are, catching criminals and working in the war zone, etc., our investigation revealed that there are also plenty of corrupt officers within its ranks, and that's something that the SBU itself should be fighting, as well as the military prosecutor and so on and so forth. And yet, we have many doubts that this is going to happen, that actually, because of this propaganda rhetoric, this patriotic rhetoric. And one more point I'm going to make is that a lot of media themselves fall into this trap, and there is a huge, massive debate in the Ukrainian media community about what the role of the media is and should be in the times of war. Should we be an information tool? Should we be a propaganda tool? And how we should operate. And every time when I end up listening to representatives of the Ukrainian media, I'm actually struck by how many people think that they should play along those lines and sort of be patriotic media. And I've also heard many comments from my Western friends, journalists who work as journalists along the same lines. They're saying we don't trust the Ukrainian media anymore because they tend to be on the patriotic side, and they don't do the due diligence. They don't actually do their work. So these are just some of the effects of the propaganda and some of the elements of the environment that we have to deal with, but obviously not all. I'll stop right there.
So Russian propaganda is bad, but Ukrainian propaganda is good, because we're fighting a war, yes?
Well, so they believe.
In a simplified kind of an approach. Thank you, Katya. Well, Tanya Matyczak has been dealing with the bad Russian propaganda in a very, very hands-on way. As one of the founding fathers or mothers, as the case may be, of Stop Fake, she has been exposing some of these lies that the Russians have been producing in a very direct way. As the Russian propaganda machine works 24 hours a day, what are the greatest challenges that you are facing, Tanya? And how do you select the falsehoods that you deal with, considering the fact that there are so many? And in light of what Katya just said, would we perhaps someday also have to say stop fake towards some Ukrainian stories that are being spun by the government, or the good patriotic media?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for inviting to this great discussion. And I'd like to add to Anne's words about propaganda and disinformation. And I agree that not all the propaganda is disinformation. Sometimes propaganda can propagate some positive terms or positive events, but Stop Fake deals only with fakes. So I cannot say that we fight propaganda, we fight fakes, we fight disinformation. And we fight not only Russian fakes, but Ukrainian fakes too. And our goal is to debunk all the fakes about Ukraine. And it doesn't matter where they come from Russian media, Ukrainian media, or Western media. And at the same time, I'd like to add that we don't try to debunk all the fakes, because it's impossible. As you mentioned, that machine works 24 hours a day. That's why we try to debunk fakes, to show some fakes, to show the main messages of this disinformation campaign. And we usually prefer to use the term Kremlin propaganda, not Russian propaganda, but Kremlin propaganda, because they propagate the point of view of Vladimir Putin, of Kremlin, and that is why I think that it's not necessary to debunk all the fakes. It's necessary just to show that so many fakes exist, and by now we have about 400 stories on our websites. So we debunked about 400 fakes about Ukraine, and looking at those fakes, you can see the main messages about Ukraine and the main messages which Russian media, Russian state-controlled media use about Ukraine, about Ukrainian authorities. And you can see the main media which produce fakes. So you can understand which kind of media you can trust and which kind of media don't produce fake about Ukraine or produce not so many fakes. So the main goal is just to show, to expose the most popular fakes and to show to the Ukrainian journalists that they should verify all the information that they get, because sometimes Ukrainian fakes come from Russian fakes when Ukrainian journalists don't verify the information. And I'd like to add that Anne is right, that now it's very easy to produce fakes due to Photoshop and all these possibilities of the internet, but at the same time it's very easy to debunk fakes. And it was surprising for me last year when we started providing workshops and trainings for Ukrainian journalists and for Ukrainian NGOs. And some Ukrainian journalists asked me, how could you understand that it was a photo fake? And I answered, well, we just found the original and that's it. And they asked me, and how did you do this? And I was surprised that some Ukrainian journalists didn't know how to use the Google image search to find the original of the photo. Yes, now it seems very funny, and now I hope that everybody understands how to find the original of the photo in the internet. But a year ago, I had many such questions. So I can advise to verify all the information that you receive. So when somebody asks me how can I understand which information I should verify and which one I shouldn't, answer that I verify all the information. So even if it comes from the media which I trust, I understand that this media may not produce fakes, but the journalists of that media can make mistakes too. We all are people. So that's it.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the first question, and then we'll open the floor to discussion, if you don't mind. I'd like to pick up on what Katya said, the desire or the insistence that the media in Ukraine be patriotic, that they sort of serve the cause because the country is at war, the aggressor is greater and stronger than Ukraine, so I suppose the justification or the rationale is that we have to sort of band together and support our government who's fighting this invasion. How do we deal with this kind of expectation? Let's put it that way.
I think you have to start with asking yourself what the definition of patriotism is. What do you mean by patriotic media? I mean, actually, I do think Ukraine should have patriotic media. Ukraine's patriotic media should support, the growth and development of a, open, democratic, and prosperous Ukraine. Okay, so then now once you've decided that, the question is how do you get there? So, do you get there by ignoring corruption? No, I don't think so. I mean, I think what you should do is say we are patriotic, and we believe that the war against corruption is a parallel to the war against Russia in the East, that they're part of the same thing. They're both wars against a particular system that evolved here. after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And, you know, there are both wars for, for a new kind of Ukrainian values, and we're fighting them both at the same time, and that's because we're patriotic. And that, you know, that to me is the correct answer to that question. You know, that you see the battle against corruption is as debilitating and as potentially destabilizing, and also as dangerous for Ukrainian sovereignty as the war in the East.
But the government may not understand that.
Keep explaining it to them.
Yeah, but also, I mean, ultimately, we go back to the understanding of the role of the media in the society, and there is a lack of understanding of the role of the media in society, and hence this concept that media should be patriotic, because the media has a very clear and specific role, and the role is to inform. Okay, there could be, you know, some inform about corruption, others just put out straight news, others are sort of lifestyle things that deal with celebrities, but it's still, the function is the same, it's information. Everything else is kind of secondary, and unless you have information, you cannot take decisions. I mean, there is no basis for decision making, even for the government. And you know, so if that role is corrupted somehow, you know, through becoming more patriotic and hiding some parts of information, the decisions, the derivatives of that will be also you know, somehow skewed, and it's very important, and not many people understand that. And again, when we talk about propaganda and being patriotic, you know, it's the government's role to be patriotic, and it's their role to fight the war, to have effective diplomacy, you know, to and to have good speakers in their ministries and agencies who are able to provide full information on demand. Because at the moment we see an information policy in Ukraine which exists in a parallel reality to the needs of journalists. You know, on one hand you get all these young people who speak English, etc., go in front of you know, audiences and talk about, but you know, we created this website so and so, we have a database such and such, and things like that. And yes, it's very important, and we use all that as a tool, but at the end of the day, we have deadlines and we have our needs, and before the deadline, we have to come back to you and say, you know, you're accused of corruption. How do you comment on that? And that's just something that you can't do, because our need is not met. The demand and supply do not meet. They are like in parallel realities.
We have a half an hour left, and I'd like to open up the floor to your questions. And I'd like our discussion to be perhaps under the heading of a good quote from George Orwell, who wrote, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." So let's try to be revolutionary in our questions, shall we? Not all at once.
Well, in that case, if we're
Yes.
going to be revolutionary, we talked about...
Please tell us who you are.
My name's Charles Bonds. I'm a doctoral candidate in Indiana University, and I'm